They chose my sister over me at my biggest moment, but when that CEO walked into our family dinner and said what he said about my real work, everything changed forever. The rain was hitting the restaurant windows that night, each drop catching the warm light from inside, while I sat there watching my parents beam at Sarah like she had just discovered fire. I had been invisible to them for so long that I almost believed I deserved it, almost convinced myself that being the forgotten child was simply my role in this family story. But that night, when David Chin from Chin Industries looked directly at me and spoke those words that shattered everything they thought they knew, I realized some truths are too powerful to stay buried. Before I share what happened in that restaurant, I want to know you are listening to my story. Just say listening in the comments or tell me where you are right now. I love knowing how far these words travel and that someone else understands what it feels like to be overlooked by the people who should see you most clearly. The favoritism started when Sarah and I were children, but it crystallized into something harder and more permanent when we both graduated college. She got the marketing degree that made my parents proud, while I quietly earned my business degree from a state school they barely acknowledged. Sarah moved back home to work at Dad's accounting firm, becoming his golden apprentice, while I took what they called a dead-end job at a small consulting company across town. Every family dinner became a celebration of Sarah's latest achievement, her newest client win, her growing responsibilities at the firm. I would sit there eating Mom's pot roast, listening to them plan Sarah's future partnership in the family business, while my own work remained as invisible as morning mist. The pattern became so predictable that I stopped trying to share my own professional updates. When I mentioned landing my first major client, Dad barely looked up from his newspaper. When I talked about expanding into new markets, Mom changed the subject to Sarah's upcoming presentation to the Chamber of Commerce. It was easier to let them assume I was struggling than to keep offering pieces of my success to people who had no interest in catching them. So I learned to eat my dinner in silence, to nod appreciatively at Sarah's stories, to play the role of the underachieving younger sibling who was grateful just to be included at the family table. But while they were busy polishing Sarah's crown, I was building something they never bothered to notice. Those long nights I told them I was working late at the office, I was actually developing relationships with clients who would change everything. The weekend trips they assumed were desperate attempts to escape my failures were actually business development meetings in other cities. The expensive clothes I started wearing that made Mom ask if I was spending beyond my means were actually appropriate attire for the boardrooms where I was closing deals they could never imagine. My phone started buzzing with calls from numbers they would have recognized if they had ever paid attention. Companies whose names appeared on billboards around our city were reaching out to me directly, not through my small consulting firm, but because word was spreading about the results I was delivering. I was solving problems that had stumped larger firms, creating strategies that were generating millions in revenue for my clients, building a reputation that was reaching the highest levels of corporate leadership in our region. The irony was breathtaking. While my parents worried that I would never amount to anything, I was becoming the person that other successful people called when they needed real results. While they praised Sarah for landing small local accounts, I was managing relationships with executives who controlled budgets larger than most people see in a lifetime. While they questioned my judgment and suggested I consider going back to school for something more practical, I was being invited to speak at conferences and consulted on deals that would reshape entire industries. Sarah had no idea that the brother she pitted was the same person her biggest competitor was trying desperately to hire. Dad never suspected that his disappointing younger son was the consultant his business rivals whispered about in envious tones. Mom remained blissfully unaware that her underachieving child was earning more in a single month than Sarah made in half a year. The separation between their perception and my reality had grown so vast that I sometimes felt like I was living two completely different lives. I kept waiting for the right moment to tell them, but that moment never seemed to come. How do you explain to people who have written you off that you have actually been writing your own success story all along? How do you reveal to parents who have invested all their pride in one child that their other child has been quietly building an empire they never bothered to notice? The longer I waited, the more complicated the truth became, and the more impossible it seemed to bridge the gap between who they thought I was and who I had actually become. The weight of carrying that secret was exhausting. Sitting through family dinners where they analyzed Sarah's minor victories while remaining completely oblivious to my major achievements felt like living in an alternate reality. Listening to them worry about my future while I was actively shaping the futures of companies they would never even dream of approaching required a level of self-control that left me drained. Watching them treat me like the family failure while I was becoming one of the most sought-after business minds in the region was a special kind of torture. But I told myself it was better this way. Better to let them believe what they wanted to believe than to disrupt their carefully constructed family narrative. Better to protect them from the shock of discovering how wrong they had been about everything. Better to maintain the peace than to force them to confront the uncomfortable reality that their golden child was actually living in the shadow of the son they had dismissed. The consulting firm where I officially worked had become just a convenient cover story. My real business was conducted through relationships I had cultivated personally, deals I structured independently, strategies I developed that had my name attached to them in corporate circles where it actually mattered. The partners at my firm knew exactly what I was bringing to the table, which is why they gave me the freedom to operate essentially as my own entity while maintaining the appearance of being just another employee. My assistant, Jennifer, had become skilled at managing the delicate dance of keeping my two worlds separate. She would schedule my high-profile meetings for times when I was least likely to encounter anyone from my family. She would handle my correspondence with major clients using discretion that protected both my professional relationships and my personal privacy. She understood that the man who commanded respect in executive suites was the same man whose parents still asked if he needed money for groceries. The financial success that came with my growing reputation was substantial, but I was careful to keep the evidence of it subtle. I upgraded my apartment, but chose something nice rather than ostentatious. I bought better clothes, but nothing that would scream wealth to people who were not paying attention. I drove a car that was reliable and comfortable without being flashy enough to raise questions I was not ready to answer. Every choice was calculated to maintain the fiction that allowed my family to continue believing what they needed to believe. Sarah remained completely unaware that her little brother had become a force in the business community that she was trying so hard to impress. She would come home from work excited about meeting minor local business owners, while I was consulting with CEOs who controlled those business owners' largest competitors. She would celebrate landing accounts worth thousands of dollars, while I was structuring deals worth millions. The disconnect between her reality and mine had grown so wide that we were essentially living in parallel universes. My parents' pride in Sarah's conventional success made perfect sense to them. She was following a path they understood, achieving milestones they could measure, building a career that fit their expectations for what success should look like. My path was invisible to them because it existed outside their frame of reference, operating at a level they had never imagined their underachieving son could reach. Their blindness to my achievements was not malicious, it was simply the natural result of assumptions they had made and never thought to question. But those assumptions were about to be tested in ways none of us could have predicted. The business world I inhabited was beginning to intersect with the family world where I was still treated like a disappointment. The reputation I had built in corporate circles was starting to reach people who might actually know my parents. The careful separation I had maintained between my professional success and my personal family role was becoming harder to sustain. Chin Industries had been courting me for months, ever since their leadership team had seen the results I had delivered for their biggest competitor. David Chin himself had called me directly, which was unusual for a CEO of his stature, but my work had caught his attention in ways that demanded a personal response. The project he wanted to discuss was massive, the kind of engagement that would establish me permanently in the top tier of business consultants in our region. But accepting it would also mean stepping fully into the spotlight in ways that might make my secret impossible to keep. The irony was that Sarah had been trying to get Chin Industries to even return her calls for months. Dad's firm had submitted proposal after proposal to them without success. They represented exactly the kind of prestigious client that would validate everything my family believed about Sarah's rising star. Meanwhile, David Chin was personally recruiting me for a project that would dwarf anything Sarah had ever worked on, and my parents had no idea that their disappointing son was the person Chin Industries actually wanted. The meeting with Chin was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon at his corporate offices downtown. I had been there before for preliminary discussions, walking through marble lobbies and executive floors that represented the pinnacle of business success in our city. The building itself was a symbol of the level at which I now operated, filled with the kind of people who controlled decisions that shaped entire industries. But to my parents, I was still the son who worked at a small consulting firm and probably spent his afternoons doing paperwork for more important people. That Tuesday meeting changed everything in ways I could never have anticipated. David Chin did not just offer me the project, he offered me something much more significant. He wanted me to become the lead strategic consultant for a complete corporate restructuring that would affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars in assets. He was essentially asking me to become his right hand for the most important business transformation his company had ever undertaken. The compensation package he offered was more money than I had ever imagined earning, but more importantly, it was recognition that I had arrived at the absolute top of my profession. But Chin wanted more than just my professional expertise. He wanted me to become the public face of the transformation, to speak at press conferences and industry events, to represent his company at meetings with other major corporate leaders. He was asking me to step out of the shadows and into the spotlight in ways that would make my secret impossible to maintain. Accepting his offer would mean revealing to everyone, including my family, exactly who I had become while they were busy underestimating me. I told Chin I needed a few days to consider his offer, but we both knew I was going to say yes. The opportunity was too significant to pass up, and the professional recognition was something I had earned through years of hard work and brilliant results. But accepting meant that the comfortable fiction my family had been living was about to be shattered, and I was not sure any of us were ready for that conversation. The weekend before I was supposed to give Chin my final answer, Mom called to invite me to a family dinner on Sunday. Sarah had apparently landed what she considered a major account, and they wanted to celebrate her success with a special meal at Romano's, our family's favorite restaurant. I almost declined, knowing that sitting through another evening of Sarah's celebration while carrying Chen's offer in my pocket would be particularly difficult. But something made me say yes, perhaps the knowledge that this might be the last family dinner where they still believed their old story about who I was. Sunday evening arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that makes restaurant lights look especially warm and inviting. Romano's was busy with other families enjoying their own Sunday celebrations, the dining room filled with the comfortable sounds of conversation and clinking silverware. We were seated at our usual corner table, the one Mom preferred because it felt private enough for family conversations, but visible enough to see other diners she might recognize from around town. Sarah was practically glowing with excitement about her latest client win, a local restaurant chain that had agreed to let Dad's firm handle their accounting for all 6 locations. It was legitimately good news for Sarah and a solid addition to Dad's business, but listening to them celebrate an account worth maybe $50,000 in annual fees while I was sitting on an offer worth more than they would make in several years felt surreal. I smiled and congratulated Sarah genuinely, because her success was real even if it existed in a completely different universe from mine. Dad was particularly proud that night, talking about how Sarah's client development skills were exactly what his firm needed to grow to the next level. He spoke about planning to make her a junior partner within the next 2 years, about gradually transitioning more responsibility to her so that she could eventually take over the business he had spent decades building. The future they were painting together was clear and bright and completely dependent on the assumption that Sarah was the only child in the family with real business potential. Mom kept asking me about my own work with the kind of polite interest that made it obvious she expected nothing newsworthy in response. She wondered if I was still enjoying my job at the consulting firm, if I had been given any new responsibilities lately, if I thought there might be opportunities for advancement in my future. Her questions were gentle and well-meaning, but they carried the underlying assumption that my career was something small and static, unlikely to produce surprises or dramatic developments. I answered her questions with the same careful vagueness I had perfected over months of family dinners. Yes, work was going well. Yes, I was staying busy with various projects. Yes, there seemed to be some potential for growth in the future. Nothing I said was technically untrue, but nothing I said revealed the massive transformation that was about to reshape my entire professional life. I was protecting them from a truth that would have been too large for that dinner conversation. But as we were finishing our main course, something happened that made protecting them impossible. David Chin walked into Romano's with his wife and teenage daughter, clearly planning to enjoy their own family dinner at a restaurant they had probably chosen for the same reasons my parents loved it. He saw me immediately from across the dining room, and his face lit up with recognition and genuine warmth. What happened next changed everything, because David Chin was not the kind of man who simply nodded politely from across a restaurant and minded his own business. He was the kind of leader who commanded attention wherever he went, and when he saw someone he respected, he made sure everyone around him knew it. David Chin was walking directly toward our table with the kind of confident stride that commanded attention from every person in the restaurant. My parents looked up curiously as this distinguished man in an expensive suit approached our family dinner, clearly wondering who he was and why he seemed to be heading straight for us. Sarah paused mid-sentence in her celebration story, her eyes following this imposing figure who was disrupting our quiet family moment with his obvious intention to join our conversation. I felt my carefully constructed worlds colliding in real time, months of separation between my professional success and family disappointment about to be obliterated by a handshake and whatever David Chin was planning to say. There was no way to warn my parents about what was coming, no way to prepare them for the revelation that was walking toward us with determined steps across Romano's crowded dining room. The secret I had been protecting was about to explode in the most public way possible, witnessed by the people whose opinion had shaped my entire sense of self-worth. My heart was racing as Chin reached our table, but his smile was warm and genuine as he extended his hand toward me with the kind of respect that successful people show to other successful people. He did not even glance at my parents or Sarah initially, his full attention focused on me as if I were the only person at the table worth acknowledging. The contrast between his obvious regard for me and my family's complete confusion was so stark that I could see them struggling to process what they were witnessing. But before Chin could speak, before he could shatter their assumptions with whatever words were forming in his mind, I need to tell you how I got to this moment. I need you to understand the journey that brought me from being the family disappointment to being the person David Chin crossed a restaurant to greet with genuine enthusiasm. The story of my hidden success is not just about business deals and financial achievements, it is about learning to value myself even when the people who should have valued me most could not see my worth. 3 years earlier, when I first started at Morrison Consulting, I was exactly what my parents thought I was, a recent graduate with limited experience trying to find my place in a competitive business world. The firm was small, maybe 15 employees total, and they hired me as a junior analyst with the kind of entry-level responsibilities that would have bored most ambitious college graduates. I was supposed to do research, prepare reports, and support the senior consultants who handled the important client relationships. It was honest work, but it was not the kind of position that would have impressed anyone at a family dinner. But I discovered something about myself in those early months that changed everything. While my colleagues were content to do exactly what was asked of them and nothing more, I became obsessed with understanding not just what our clients needed, but why they needed it and how those needs connected to larger patterns in their industries. I would stay late reading annual reports and industry analyses, not because anyone asked me to, but because I was genuinely fascinated by the complex problems these companies were trying to solve. My first breakthrough came with a manufacturing client that Morrison had been working with for years without achieving significant results. The senior partner had assigned me to update their quarterly efficiency report, the kind of routine task that junior analysts handled without anyone expecting insight or innovation. But as I dug into their data, I started noticing patterns that the previous reports had missed, inefficiencies that were costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars annually without anyone realizing the connection between seemingly separate operational issues. I spent weeks developing a comprehensive analysis that went far beyond the simple efficiency report I had been asked to prepare. I identified 17 specific changes that could be implemented immediately to reduce costs and improve productivity, and I projected exactly how much money each change would save over different time periods. When I presented my findings to the senior partner, He stared at the report for almost 10 minutes without speaking, clearly recognizing that his junior analyst had produced something that would transform their relationship with this client. The manufacturing company implemented 12 of my 17 recommendations within 3 months, and their quarterly profits increased by more than anyone had projected. But more importantly for my career, word started spreading within their industry about the consultant who had solved problems that had stumped other firms for years. The CEO started recommending Morrison Consulting specifically because of the work I had done, and other manufacturing companies began reaching out to us with similar challenges. That success opened doors I had never expected to walk through. Companies that had never heard of Morrison Consulting were specifically requesting me by name for projects that other firms had failed to complete successfully. My reputation was growing independently of the firm that employed me, based on results I was delivering and relationships I was building with clients who valued innovation over credentials. I was becoming known as the consultant who could see solutions that others missed, who could identify opportunities that transformed entire business operations. The financial rewards followed naturally from the professional recognition. Morrison started assigning me to higher-value projects with more substantial fees, and my compensation increased dramatically as I brought in clients who were willing to pay premium rates for the kind of results I was delivering. But more important than the money was the respect I was earning from business leaders who controlled decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. Within 18 months, I was essentially operating as an independent consultant who happened to work through Morrison as a convenient business structure. The partners gave me complete autonomy to pursue clients and projects that interested me, understanding that my success was driving growth for the entire firm. I was invited to industry conferences not as Morrison's representative, but as a recognized expert in operational efficiency and strategic planning. My name was appearing in business publications as someone who was reshaping how companies approached complex organizational challenges. The transformation was so complete that I sometimes felt like I was living someone else's life. The junior analyst who had been hired to prepare routine reports had evolved into a strategic consultant whose recommendations were implemented at the highest levels of major corporations. Companies were restructuring entire departments based on strategies I developed, and the results were exceeding everyone's expectations, including my own. I had found my calling in work that challenged me intellectually while producing tangible improvements in how businesses operated. But the success that was transforming my professional life remained completely invisible to my family. They saw me leaving for work every morning and returning every evening, but they had no idea that my days were filled with meetings with executives who controlled budgets larger than most people could imagine. They knew I traveled occasionally for business, but they assumed those trips were routine conferences or training seminars rather than strategic planning sessions with companies whose names they would have recognized from news headlines. The disconnect between my reality and their perception became more pronounced as my success accelerated. While they worried that I was not advancing fast enough in my career, I was being headhunted by larger consulting firms who wanted to build entire practices around the methodologies I had developed. While they suggested I consider going back to school to improve my credentials, I was being invited to guest lecture at business schools about innovative approaches to organizational transformation. Sarah's achievements, which my parents celebrated so enthusiastically, were taking place in a completely different universe from mine. She was learning to manage small client relationships and basic accounting procedures, while I was designing strategic frameworks that were being adopted across entire industries. Her biggest victory was landing a local restaurant chain, while I was consulting with corporations that controlled restaurant chains in multiple states. The comparison was not fair to either of us, but the complete reversal of what my parents believed about our respective potential was staggering. I kept telling myself that revealing the truth would only complicate everyone's life unnecessarily. My parents were proud of Sarah and happy with the family narrative they had constructed around her success and my struggle to find direction. Disrupting that narrative would require them to question assumptions they had held for years and confront the possibility that they had fundamentally misunderstood their own children. It seemed kinder to let them maintain their illusions than to force them to deal with uncomfortable realities. But maintaining the illusion was becoming increasingly difficult as my professional profile continued to rise. Local business publications were running articles about my innovative consulting approaches, and my photo was appearing at industry events alongside executives whose companies my parents would have recognized. The risk of accidental discovery was growing with every public appearance and every new client relationship. Someone from their social circle was eventually going to see my name associated with major business deals and ask questions that would be impossible to deflect. The Chin Industries opportunity represented the culmination of everything I had been building toward, but it also represented the end of my ability to keep my two worlds separate. David Chin was not just another client offering another project. He was offering me a position that would make me one of the most visible business consultants in our region. Accepting his offer would mean stepping into a spotlight that would make my secret impossible to maintain. Chin had first heard about me through mutual connections in the manufacturing industry. Executives who had seen the results I delivered and recommended me when Chin Industries was struggling with operational challenges that traditional consulting firms had been unable to solve. He arranged our first meeting with the kind of personal attention that CEOs reserve for people they consider strategic partners rather than mere service providers. From the beginning, he treated me as an equal whose expertise he genuinely respected and needed. Our preliminary meetings had taken place in his executive conference room overlooking the city. Discussions that ranged from specific operational improvements to broader strategic vision for how Chin Industries could evolve to meet changing market conditions. He was not just looking for someone to implement changes he had already decided upon. He wanted someone who could help him see opportunities and challenges that he might be missing from his position at the top of a complex organization. The project he ultimately offered me was unprecedented in scope and significance. Chin Industries was planning a complete transformation that would affect every aspect of their operations, from supply chain management to customer relations to employee development. He wanted me to lead the strategic planning process, to serve as the primary consultant who would design and oversee implementation of changes that would reshape his entire company. It was the kind of engagement that established consultants spend decades building toward, and he was offering it to me based purely on the reputation I had earned through consistent results. But Chin wanted more than just my behind-the-scenes expertise. He wanted me to become the public face of the transformation, to represent Chin Industries at press conferences and industry events where the changes would be announced and explained to stakeholders throughout the region. He was asking me to step forward as his partner in communications that would be covered by business media and analyzed by competitors who were watching Chin Industries for signs of strategic direction. The financial compensation was extraordinary, more money than I had ever imagined earning and enough to establish me permanently in the top tier of business consultants. But the professional recognition was even more valuable, the kind of visibility that would open doors to opportunities one could not yet envision. Accepting Chen's offer would mean acknowledging publicly that I had become one of the most sought-after strategic minds in our business community. I had been scheduled to give Chin my final answer the following week, but as he approached our family table that Sunday evening, I realized that the decision was about to be made for me in the most unexpected way possible. My carefully maintained separation between professional success and family disappointment was about to end not through my own revelation, but through an accidental encounter in our favorite restaurant. Sarah was staring at Chin with obvious recognition, clearly trying to remember where she had seen this important-looking man who was walking toward our table with such obvious purpose. Dad was straightening his tie unconsciously, the way he did when meeting someone whose success he instinctively recognized even without knowing specific details. Mom was glancing between Chin and me with growing confusion, clearly wondering what connection I could possibly have with someone who commanded this level of presence and attention. Chin reached our table and extended his hand toward me with a smile that conveyed genuine warmth and professional respect. But before he could speak, before he could shatter my family's assumptions with whatever greeting was forming in his mind, I felt the weight of 3 years of hidden success pressing against this moment of inevitable revelation. Everything I had built while they were busy underestimating me was about to become impossible to deny or explain away. The restaurant around us continued its normal evening rhythm, other families enjoying their dinners without any idea that our quiet corner table was about to become the site of a conversation that would change everything my parents believed about their own children. The rain was still hitting the windows, but inside Romano's the atmosphere was warm and comfortable, the perfect setting for family celebrations and the completely unexpected moment when hidden truths refused to stay buried any longer. David Chin was standing at our table now, his hand extended toward me, his face showing the kind of respect that successful people show to other successful people. And my parents were about to discover that their disappointing younger son was actually someone who commanded that level of recognition from one of the most powerful business leaders in our region. David Chen's handshake was firm and confident as he looked directly into my eyes with the kind of genuine respect that cannot be faked or manufactured. His voice carried clearly across our corner of the restaurant as he spoke words that would shatter everything my family thought they knew about me. He said my name with the kind of recognition that important people reserve for other important people, and then he said something that made the entire restaurant seem to fall silent around our table. "I hope you've had a chance to consider our offer," Chen said with a warm smile that conveyed both professional respect and personal fondness. "I know it's a big decision, but I want you to know that everyone at Chen Industries is excited about the possibility of working with you on this transformation. The board meeting went exceptionally well after I shared your strategic analysis, and I think I can safely say that you're exactly the kind of innovative thinker we need to lead this project." My parents' faces went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if the situation had not been so emotionally charged. Confusion shifted to recognition as they processed that this distinguished man was not just being polite to their underachieving son, but was actually discussing what sounded like a significant business opportunity. Dad's mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to ask a question, but could not figure out what question would make sense in this surreal moment. Sarah looked like someone had just explained a magic trick that defied everything she thought she understood about how the world worked. Her celebration dinner had suddenly become background noise to a conversation that revealed her little brother was operating in business circles she had only dreamed of accessing. The restaurant chain account she had been so proud of landing seemed to shrink in significance as she listened to David Chin discuss strategic analyses and board meetings and company transformations. "David," I managed to say, standing up to shake his hand properly while trying to process the fact that my two worlds were colliding in the most public way possible. "I wasn't expecting to see you tonight. This is my family, my parents Robert and Helen, and my sister Sarah." I made the introductions with as much composure as I could manage, but inside I was scrambling to figure out how to handle a situation I had never prepared for. Chin turned his attention to my parents with the kind of gracious professionalism that successful executives display when meeting the families of people they respect. "It's wonderful to meet you," he said warmly, shaking Dad's hand with genuine enthusiasm. "You should be incredibly proud of your son. He's developed some of the most innovative strategic frameworks I've encountered in 30 years of business, and his analysis of our operational challenges was absolutely brilliant." Dad shook Chen's hand like he was in a dream, clearly struggling to connect the conversation he was hearing with the son he thought he knew. "I'm sorry," Dad said slowly, "but I think there might be some confusion. My son works at Morrison Consulting as a junior analyst. Are you perhaps thinking of someone else with the same name?" The smile that crossed Chen's face suggested he was beginning to understand the family dynamics he had accidentally stepped into. "Morrison Consulting," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, that's where he's officially employed, but I think you might be surprised to learn about the level of work he's actually doing there. Your son has been consulting with some of the largest companies in our region, and his reputation in strategic planning circles is quite remarkable." Mom was staring at me like she had never seen me before, her eyes searching my face for some explanation of how the disappointing son she worried about constantly had somehow become the subject of such glowing praise from someone who was clearly a major business leader. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "He never mentioned working with any large companies. We thought he was still doing entry-level research and report writing." Chen's expression became even more thoughtful as he began to grasp the full extent of the disconnect between my family's perception and my professional reality. Perhaps we should let you enjoy your family dinner, he said diplomatically. But I hope you'll consider joining my wife and me for coffee after your meal. I think there are some things about your son's work that might surprise you, and I'd be happy to share some details about why Chin Industries is so eager to bring him on as our lead strategic consultant. The words lead strategic consultant hung in the air like a revelation that reorganized everything my parents thought they understood about their own family. Sarah's face had gone pale as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. Her little brother, the family disappointment she had always felt slightly sorry for, was apparently being recruited by one of the most prominent business leaders in our city for a position that sounded more important than anything she had ever imagined achieving. Chin excused himself gracefully and returned to his own family's table, leaving us sitting in a silence that felt heavy with unspoken questions and shattered assumptions. The celebration dinner that had been focused on Sarah's restaurant chain victory now seemed like it belonged to a different universe, one where the family hierarchy made sense and everyone understood their proper roles. That universe had just been obliterated by a 5-minute conversation with a man whose presence commanded respect from everyone in the restaurant. Dad was the first to break the silence, his voice careful and measured as if he was afraid that speaking too loudly might make this strange new reality disappear. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, looking at me with eyes that seemed to be seeing me clearly for the first time in years. "How long have you been working with companies like Chin Industries without telling us?" The question I had been dreading for months was finally being asked, and there was no way to deflect or minimize the truth any longer. "About 3 years," I said quietly, watching their faces as they tried to process the timeline. "It started small, with one manufacturing client, but it grew into something much larger than I ever expected. I kept meaning to tell you, but it became more complicated as time went on." Sarah found her voice first, though it sounded strained and uncertain. 3 years, she repeated slowly. "You've been doing this kind of work for 3 years while we thought you were struggling to get ahead at a small consulting firm. How is that even possible? How did we not know?" The hurt in her voice was genuine, and I realized that my decision to keep my success secret had not just protected my parents from uncomfortable truths. It had also deprived Sarah of the chance to know and respect her brother for who he had actually become. She had been living with a false sense of superiority that was built on incomplete information, and discovering the truth was forcing her to question everything she thought she knew about our relationship. I didn't set out to hide it, I tried to explain, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of the revelation. At first, it really was small projects that didn't seem worth mentioning. But as my reputation grew and the opportunities became larger, it felt like the gap between what you believed about me and what was actually happening had become too wide to bridge easily. Mom was shaking her head slowly, her expression cycling between confusion and something that looked like grief. "We've been treating you like you needed our help and advice about your career," she said softly. "We've been worried about your future and suggesting you consider going back to school for better credentials. Meanwhile, you've been working at a level we never imagined you could reach." The weight of their concern hit me harder than their dismissal ever had. For 3 years, they had been carrying worry about my prospects while I was building a reputation that put me at the top of my profession. Their love had been expressed through anxiety about my success, while I was achieving success beyond anything they had dreamed possible for either of their children. The irony was almost too painful to contemplate. Dad leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on my face, as if he was trying to memorize features he had somehow never noticed before. "Chin Industries," he said slowly. "That's one of the largest companies in the region. David Chin is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And he's trying to recruit you for a leadership position." The disbelief in his voice was understandable, but it also revealed how completely he had underestimated his own son's capabilities. For years, he had been planning Sarah's future as his business successor while remaining blind to the possibility that his other child might be building something even more impressive. The family business that had seemed like such an important legacy was tiny compared to the corporations I was helping to transform. "The offer is extraordinary," I admitted, feeling the relief of finally being able to speak honestly about my professional life. It would mean leading the strategic planning for a complete corporate transformation, working directly with their executive team, representing the company at major industry events. It's the kind of opportunity that most consultants spend their entire careers building toward. Sarah was quiet for a long time, processing information that was forcing her to completely reconsider her understanding of our family dynamics. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than hurt. "I've been trying to get Chin Industries to even return my calls for months," she said quietly. "Dad's firm submitted 3 different proposals to them without getting a response. And they've been personally recruiting you." The question highlighted the complete reversal of what everyone had believed about our respective positions in the business world. Sarah had been trying unsuccessfully to access the same company that was actively pursuing me for a leadership role. The family success story they had been celebrating was taking place in the shadow of achievements they had never bothered to notice. I nodded slowly, watching her face as she processed the implications. "David Chin called me personally about 6 months ago. The initial project grew into something much larger as we worked together, and now they want me to essentially become their primary strategic partner for the foreseeable future." 6 months ago, Dad repeated, his voice carrying a note of wonder. 6 months ago, we were still suggesting you consider looking for a more stable position with better advancement opportunities. We had no idea you were already operating at the highest levels of corporate consulting. The absurdity of the situation was becoming clear to all of us. While they had been worrying about my career prospects, I had been turning down opportunities from companies they would have considered unreachably prestigious. While they had been celebrating Sarah's small victories, I had been achieving successes that dwarfed anything they had imagined possible. The family narrative they had constructed was completely backwards. Chin appeared at our table again, this time with his wife, a gracious woman who introduced herself as Linda and immediately made our family feel comfortable despite the emotional intensity of the moment. "I hope you don't mind the interruption," she said warmly, "but David has been talking about your son's work for months, and I was curious to meet the family that raised such an innovative thinker." Her words carried the kind of genuine respect that cannot be manufactured, and it was clear that Chin had been discussing my work in their personal conversations with the enthusiasm that successful people reserve for colleagues they truly admire. The idea that my name had been mentioned in their home, that my strategies and insights had been topics of dinner conversation between a CEO and his wife, was almost surreal given how invisible my work had been to my own family. "We're still learning about his work ourselves," Mom admitted with a combination of embarrassment and pride that perfectly captured the emotional complexity of the moment. "It seems we've been significantly underestimating our son's achievements." Linda Chin smiled with the kind of understanding that suggested she had encountered family dynamics like ours before. "That's not uncommon with people who achieve success quietly," she said gently. "Some of the most accomplished people I know are the ones who focus on results rather than recognition, and it sounds like your son has been building something remarkable while maintaining his humility." Her words reframed my secrecy in a way that made it seem like a virtue rather than a deception, though I knew the reality was more complicated than either interpretation suggested. I had not been maintaining humility so much as protecting myself from the vulnerability of sharing achievements with people who had consistently failed to see my potential. But her generous interpretation allowed my family to process the revelation without having to confront the more painful implications of their blindness to my success. Chin himself was remarkably gracious about the awkward situation he had inadvertently created. "I realize this is probably overwhelming," he said, addressing my parents directly. "But I want you to know that your son's reputation in our business community is extraordinary. He's the kind of strategic thinker that companies compete to work with, and his ability to see solutions that others miss has made him one of the most sought-after consultants in our region." Dad shook his head slowly, still struggling to reconcile the man Chin was describing with the son he thought he knew. "We owe you an apology," he said finally, looking directly at me. "We've been treating you like someone who needed guidance and support, when apparently you've been operating at a level that's beyond anything we ever achieved ourselves." The apology was unexpected and more emotionally powerful than I had anticipated. For 3 years, I had been carrying resentment about their dismissal of my potential, their assumption that Sarah was the only child capable of real achievement, their casual disregard for work that was transforming my life. But hearing Dad acknowledge their misjudgment with such genuine remorse made that resentment seem less important than the possibility of building a new relationship based on accurate understanding. "You don't owe me an apology," I said, meaning it completely. "You were working with the information I gave you, and I chose to keep most of my professional life private. The fault is mine for not finding a way to share what was happening before it reached this point." Sarah had been quiet throughout most of the conversation with the Chens, but now she reached across the table and touched my hand with a gesture that felt like a truce. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "And I'm sorry we didn't see what you were building. It must have been lonely to carry all of that success without being able to share it with your family." Her words hit me harder than anything else that had been said, because they acknowledged the emotional cost of maintaining my secret in a way that no one else had recognized. It had been lonely to achieve the professional recognition I had always wanted while remaining invisible to the people whose approval had shaped my entire sense of self-worth. The success that had validated me in corporate circles had felt incomplete because it existed separate from the family relationships that still mattered most. Chin excused himself and his wife after a few more minutes of conversation, but not before confirming that he would call me the next day to discuss the timeline for my decision about joining Chin Industries. The offer was still open, he assured me, and if anything, meeting my family had reinforced his conviction that I was exactly the kind of person he wanted as a strategic partner. Their gracious handling of an awkward situation had somehow made his recruitment pitch even stronger. After the Chens left, our family sat in a silence that felt completely different from the uncomfortable quiet that had followed Chen's initial revelation. This silence was contemplative rather than shocked, filled with the weight of relationships that were being rebuilt in real time based on new understanding. The celebration dinner for Sarah's success had become something much more significant, a family reckoning that would reshape how we related to each other going forward. "So what happens now?" Mom asked finally, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than worry. "Are you going to accept Chen's offer?" The question felt like a gift because it was the first time in years that my parents had asked about my professional decisions from a position of respect rather than concern. They were treating me like someone whose judgment they trusted, whose choices would be made from strength rather than desperation. The shift in their tone represented a fundamental change in how they saw me and how they expected me to see myself. "I think I am," I said, feeling the truth of it as I spoke the words aloud. "It's an incredible opportunity, and it feels like the natural next step in everything I've been building. But it will also mean stepping into a much more public role, which means our family will have to get used to people knowing about this work." Dad smiled for the first time since Chin had approached our table, and it was a smile filled with genuine pride rather than the polite encouragement he had been offering for years. "I think we can handle having a successful son," he said. "It might take some adjustment, but I suspect we'll figure out how to be proud of you publicly instead of worrying about you privately." The drive home from Romano's that night felt like traveling between two different versions of my life. The family that had entered the restaurant still believed in their old story about success and failure, achievement and disappointment, which child had potential and which child needed help. The family that left the restaurant was carrying a completely different story, one where assumptions had been revealed as illusions and hidden truths had finally found their way into the light. I called Chin the next morning and accepted his offer, beginning a new chapter of my career that would make secrecy impossible and family pride inevitable. The transformation of Chin Industries became the most visible project of my career, covered by business media and analyzed by competitors who wanted to understand how such dramatic organizational change had been achieved so successfully. My name appeared in articles and conference programs, and my parents learned to navigate the unexpected experience of having friends and colleagues recognize their son as someone whose professional opinion was widely respected and sought. Sarah and I developed a different kind of relationship, one built on mutual respect rather than the old dynamic, where she had been the achiever and I had been the disappointment. She started asking for my advice on her own business development strategies, and I was able to help her think about her career in ways that drew on everything I had learned about building client relationships and creating value for organizations. Our sibling rivalry transformed into sibling partnership, with each of us contributing different strengths to conversations about business and family and the future we were all building together. The change in my parents was perhaps the most remarkable part of the entire experience. They went from worrying about my prospects to bragging about my achievements, from offering unsolicited career advice to asking for my perspective on their own business decisions. The son they had seen as needing guidance became the son whose guidance they valued, and that transformation affected every aspect of our family dynamics in ways that were entirely positive. Looking back, I realized that the secret I had been protecting was not just about business success or professional recognition. It was about the right to be seen accurately by the people who mattered most, to have my efforts acknowledged and my achievements celebrated by the family that had shaped my understanding of what success could look like. The revelation that happened in Romano's that night was not just about money or status or career advancement. It was about finally being known for who I had actually become rather than who they had assumed I would always be. The rain had stopped by the time we left the restaurant that Sunday evening, and the city lights were reflecting off wet streets in a way that made everything look new and full of possibility. My family walked to their cars with a different kind of conversation than they had ever had before, planning ways to celebrate achievements they were just learning to understand and talking about a future that included possibilities they had never imagined. The hidden truth that had shaped my life for 3 years was finally free to reshape all of our lives in ways that would honor both the success I had built and the relationships that had always mattered most.